vamos a trabajar sobre el aprovechamiento de las nuevas tecnologías y en este escenario contamos con la primera de nuestras conferencias del Harvard Humanitarian Initiative a cargo del doctor Patrick Vince y la doctora Phuong Pham. Patrick, ¿nos escuchas?
I can hear you and hopefully you can see me now.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I will jump right in with the sharing of my screen. And here it is. And let's move this to the full size. Well, first, let me thank you, the organizer, for inviting me to talk to you today. It's always a pleasure to engage with IMAP, which does fantastic work in the field, but also offers us with these kind of conferences and meeting an opportunity to reflect of the state on the state of the field. And so what I'll be talking about today is some of those lessons learned in the use of new technologies. And some examples. And in fact, I will start with some examples. And I understand that you've had the opportunity to hear about a number of applications and emerging solutions that are being deployed in the field. I'll be talking from the perspective of my role as a director of research at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. In this context, I do participate, engage in a number of field level emergency needs assessment and work in the field. But I'm also the founder and co-director of Kobo Toolbox, which is a digital data collection platform that really we created because at the time there was no solution that could work in constrained environment, in place where connectivity was a challenge, in place where tools needed to function in a robust manner without constant electricity, without connectivity, of course. I'll also be talking from the perspective of the Data Pop Alliance, which I co-founded with Emmanuel Letouzé, and you've already heard from him on the first day, I believe. But this initiative was really created recognizing these new streams of data, these new use of technology, and trying to reflect on how do we do this well? How do we bring responsibility? How do we put people focused at the center of this kind of digital revolution, if you like. So today, though, I'll be talking briefly about some of the major gains and challenges. Of course, I think that nobody can look at the use of technology in this field and not recognize some of the major changes that have happened. I mean, our ability to know what is happening where, our ability to understand what people are experiencing, the needs that they have is unprecedented. I mean, the level of information that we're able to gather is just incredible. Now we need to transform, of course, that information into insight, into knowledge, into action, but clearly it's happening. We are getting better at targeting those who need assistance. We're getting better at effective supply chain to provide assistance. And think about, you know, how mobile technology has really changed our ability to use cash transfer and cash modalities for assistance, for example. So clearly there are important progress on effectiveness and at the same time, a number of challenges. And that's what I will be talking today in terms of the lessons learned. But in terms of starting with some of these examples, I'll talk today about some of the use of satellite imagery, which has been around now for over a decade in humanitarian action. But there are a number of interesting developments still today, and at the same time, interesting questions as to how such technology can really be used and is useful to the field. I will be talking about natural language processing, and how that can help us really gain better and deeper insight into people's experience, needs, attitudes, experience, assets, ability to cope, for example, with disasters. I will very briefly talk about, and that's the third circle, talk about mobile phone data, if you like. I have a colleague who are going to follow me, who are true experts, leading experts on these issues, but I will just mention a couple of aspects in this that I think are relevant to this discussion. And finally, I will talk about these lessons learned as the fourth topic. So let's go into some of the satellite imagery, and I will just talk about, again, simple applications, but just show how new possibilities are emerging because of the use of technology and these new streams of data. So of course, satellite imagery has been used for humanitarian decision support, rapid assessment, just looking at images. We've all seen in the media those quite striking image of before and after type of assessment, where we can visually scale the level of damage. At the same time, 10 years ago, satellite imagery was said to be really transforming relief efforts. And clearly, it has been an added layer of information, but not necessarily one that has fully transformed how we operate things, how we assess things. And in part because the problem is not with satellite imagery, but rather how we use it. And I will talk about that in my final part of this talk. But let's go into some of the examples of what is possible with satellite imagery, and to go a little bit beyond what is possible in the visible range. Let's talk about nighttime light emission and what becomes really possible to see when you use imagery that is taken at night. Now, this is one of the products that NASA is producing. Is called the Black Marble. It's been available since 2012. It's available actually near real time globally with a turnaround of a few hours. We can start seeing what is happening at night. One of the first application in the context of humanitarian assistance or humanitarian action was some work we did around Cyclone Ida in 2019. And sorry, why is it not? Okay, it's going to move forward. I'm not going to go through all the details, but this basically shows kind of the different ways into satellite imagery can be used, from helping with forecasting all the way to having the first type of visual imagery, and then having this type of black marble, high definition, if you like, imagery that allows us, when we compare before and after, to understand what is the level of damage to the power grid. Simply put, is if the night does not turn on and the pattern in the months before the disaster was that lights were on, it's an indication, of course, that the grid is down and that people don't have electricity, or that people have moved, but it's clearly an indication of the level of damage. Now, the advantage of being able to do this is, compare, for example, to phone-based assessments or in-person needs assessment. Obviously, here we're able to cover very large areas almost automatically. We get a sense of what is the level of damage without being present on the ground, and simply by running those analysis and constantly monitoring what is going on with the grid. Now, of course, there are still questions around the suitability of this type of nighttime light emission as a proxy of impact. Is it that because the grid is down that people are affected, that houses are destroyed? It's not a direct or simple relation, but as we continue building this type of experience and expertise, we will get better at being able to transform insight into damages from nighttime light emission into insight around needs, around what needs to be done. Now, another interesting aspect of this type of streams of data is that it does also allow us to monitor reconstruction, to monitor progress towards what is happening in terms of rebuilding and recovering after damages, because as lights start to turn back on within a week, within 2 weeks, within a month, within 6 months, then we get a sense of what is happening, what is being rebuilt, what is going on, without, again, necessarily having to do expensive field survey and also being able to work in areas that are not necessarily easily accessible. Now, this type of information is useful because when you cross-reference that, for example, with information, socioeconomic information, you could see in a completely different context in Puerto Rico, for example, that areas recovering faster were the wealthier, the ones where utility companies were faster at rebuilding or repairing services, were those that were least disadvantaged, which then of course creates problems of equity and inclusion in how damages from disasters are accounted for. So again, this is just one example of what is still new and possible and things that can be explored with satellite imagery, a technology that's been around, that has been used, but that in practice is really used to kind of this high level assessment, but doesn't always translate into ongoing practice in the field. And we'll talk about some of the challenge of that after. But I wanted to switch to a very different example. And of course, this draws much more closely to some of the work we've been doing with digital data collection. And this is about natural language processing. And it's really about understanding people better. Now, I'm sure that in this audience, many people have participated, engaged into needs assessment, have engage with communities who express their experience, share what they need, share what they can do themselves, talk about really what the situation is like. And yet in our assessment, we capture only a small fraction of what people are saying. And when qualitative data is collected, even in a rich format, as opposed to just check mark, well, then when that information is collected, it's really treated and really used to drive responses. In other way, if we think about the current situations around needs assessment, for example, we've got these quantitative tools that are check marks and, you know, how many times in the last week have you eaten meat or eggs or sugar? We're all familiar with these type of food security assessment, for example. And so they rely on structured form. There's been major improvement because we can now use electronic form. Kobo Toolbox contributes to that. We have analytics software that allows us to really very quickly move from collecting these type of data to have insights and figures and be able to feed into fancy dashboards. But really this is working really well. But we are missing this qualitative part. And at the moment, the qualitative component continues to rely on recording, translating, transcribing, coding this kind of data, which rarely happens. To give you an example, in Eastern DRC, there was a major effort around communication and engagement with communities to use qualitative data. And it was only possible because the CDC devoted an entire team to read through every statement, code everything, to get insight into what people were expressing, were their concerns around Ebola, to get insights into the qualitative dimension of fear and perception of the response, vaccine hesitancy, for example. But that type of effort is very rare and not really reproducible because it is expensive, because it's large. And so there's really this loss of information when it comes to the qualitative part. In addition, we have language barrier. Many of these assessments are very one-way, extractive of information, rely on interviewers. So they're not always the most comfortable for the people that are served by humanitarian. So of course, then comes the possibility of using natural language processing to, instead of having a super structured format, allows us to really have a conversation, allows us to engage with people and discuss what their experience is, and then record that information and process it in a manner that allows to combine both qualitative and quantitative insights, allows us to automatically code, detect what people are talking about. Sentiment analysis would be a simple example of that people are probably familiar with it, but also would allow to parse the conversation to get the type of insights that are needed for action. And I'll maybe skip this step, which is then going further. Can we use this type of layer combined with other layers to get more insight? But let me go back to this idea of moving from very structured surveys to something that's less structured, that is a discussion. I'll go back to this example of food security. It's an area in which I've worked a lot and done many surveys. Again, we've got the example of food consumption index that require very quantitative assessment of what people have eaten and when. We've got coping mechanism that are also fairly standardized, where we can ask people, okay, in the past 30 days, when you did not have food or money to buy food, what have you done? And so you can say, how often have you relied on less preferred food every day? You're familiar with these type of assessments. Now imagine if instead of that, we were able to go to people and ask them recently, how has your household coped when you did not have enough food or money to buy food? How often has this happened? And then the person can respond to you, every day we have to beg and ask our friends and neighbors for food. They can only give us rice and sometimes meat, but it's not enough. The church helps us too and let us harvest from their gardens sometimes, but not very often. In the end, there's not much we can do, but we are hungry all the time. That sentence here, of course, it's actually taken from a real context, but that sentence is so much richer than what we get from the quantitative interview. And yet it has all the information we need from a quantitative perspective, but it also gives us these type of in-depth insights. So then the work really now is to start improving how we're capturing and treating this qualitative type of data, with ultimately the goal to be able to rely much more on these type of efforts. So, oops, I don't know why there's this fancy animation here, but so just to give an example, I give the caveat I work with Cobot, but what we are doing there is, at a very low level, we're now starting to make sure people can record easily within the forms. Now it has interest in terms of quality control as well. So we can go back to what was said during an interview. So we can make sure that interviewers are doing their work, that we understand what's going on. It also means that we can go back to the dialogue to gain those type of qualitative insights. And so so this is already now possible starting recording, and you still have to then manually work on transcription, submit to have automated translation, for example. But we're working on automating this so that the goal again is that you would be able to submit your information. It would be then automatically loaded and analyzed so that you ultimately get those qualitative insights that are much richer. For example, on the role of the church, which is not a standard thing, is not something that necessarily is assessed as part of coping mechanism, but it turns out that maybe it's important for people in some context. Well, this is the type of insight we can get as we move towards natural language processing. Now, I'm showing this because it's not far-fetched. It's already largely possible to do this. It's not as quite simple as we would like it to be. There are issues, and we're working on making sure that less common languages are supported. You can already rely on tools from Google and others for common language to do transcription and translation, but that is not the case for Comanche or for other less common language for which we need to create libraries and support. But this is really happening, and it hopefully will really change that dynamic of extractive data collection processes and be much more engaging and respectful of what people have to say, what people experience during disasters. I'll switch to the third example. I'm aware also of time. And I mentioned that I was just going to be very brief on mobile phone data because my colleagues from MIT and from the FBK will be so much better than I am at talking about this. But this was pretty much the only way I was able to provide some relief in this talk and include a cartoon. that shows this family and the man. Actually, it should have been the women to be more respectful, but the man saying, "I really don't mind coming into the office to work." This, of course, reflects our long period of movement restriction. And so I mentioned this because what we've seen with COVID is really an explosion of applications and exploration of how mobile phone data can help us understand mobility, and how then mobility helps us understand and feed into epidemiological models, how it can feed and help us understand compliance with measures that are meant to reduce mobility, for example. And so it allows us to understand the impact of those protective measures and whether people are adopting them or not, for example, on the epidemic. So I'll stop here, but I wanted to highlight it as an example that many of you should be familiar with right now, that again has very practical, very real application, important limits, because the reality is the extent to which these type of data were really used to feed and really valid is questioned, in part because of adoption, in part because of concerns among the population around privacy. And so the reality is that there was still a major gap between what is technologically possible and how it is being used in the field. Now, and that will be really the focus now of the second half of the discussion. But before that, I do want to acknowledge a small lie. I said I had 3 examples. I actually added a 4th one, a very recent one, because I've been fortunate in the past to work in Ukraine and have wonderful colleagues there. And of course, we've been all concerned with what is happening there. One request that came in for us because of our work on COBO and on data collection was whether it would be possible to rapidly deploy some kind of application that would help people safeguard critical documents. The reality is that when people are in conflict and they are forced to move, and they will scramble and really quickly make sure that they've got key documents, passport, but they will forget some. In the process of moving, they may lose them. So the idea was very simple and logical, which is that we need to make it easy for people to create digital records of their key documents, whether identification, even employment record, bank records, ownership, property record, education, diplomas. All these are critical documents that we would not necessarily think about safeguarding or bringing with us when we have to flee in rapid situation. Now, what did we do? What was our solution? Well, this is what we did. We prepared and published very simple guidance on what people can do, which is gather the documents, creating digital copies by using their existing technology, phone, cameras, and then uploading these documents to existing solutions that are safe. They can email it to themselves, they can put it on Dropbox. There are a number of existing cloud solutions. Now, the reason I mentioned this is obviously this is not technological, but the demands from the field was around an app, was around thinking technologically. And our response was that one, creating an app would take some time, but even if we were able to do this so quickly, then you face challenges of adoption, diffusion, and it really does not bring such a significant added value to existing solution that the best and easiest solution is to build on what is existing. So I wanted to give this example just to highlight that technology is not necessarily always the issue. And from what I said at the very beginning, it's clear that technology has important value. But the key lessons learned has been, for me at least, that it's not about the technology. It's not about what is possible and the technology or the way the technology functions, but it's really around the technology, what I call the technology use system, how we use it, what are the parameters that go into it. Now, don't get me wrong, there are bad tools out there. There are tools that and technologies that are developed with very little understanding of what people need, with how things are operating. And so there are bad ideas. So I want to be careful when I say it's not about the technology, but by and large, there are good solutions, there are good ideas, there are good technologies, there are good streams of data, but it's about, are we prepared to use them? Are we putting in place the right structure, the right processes so that we're able uh, 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 to give uh, to people? Now, I acknowledge, I just see now that there was a question, so I'll get back to that at the end, but I want to jump into those lessons learned, because I want to talk about four elements here. The technology itself, the people, the policies and process that guide the use of technology, and the partnerships that are increasingly critical in humanitarian action. So let's start with the technology. I mean, clearly, as I mentioned before, technology presents great opportunities for humanitarian actors. You've heard so many examples in the last 2 days, and I just gave a few more. Whether those technologies fit for purpose is still something that needs to be considered. And one of the surprising aspects is how a lot of the proposed applications are fit for purpose in some very convenient, let's say, or very easy environments, but are really not applicable in constrained environments. The number of solutions, even today, that still rely on electricity 100% of the time and connectivity 100% of the time, we know that cannot work. And we know that if that's how the technology is designed, then it is going to create issues in the field. For example, we've seen voucher systems and printing systems that mean that once you lose connection, once something's happened in the fields, you can no longer make rapid changes. You cannot reprint vouchers because there was a mistake or things expired. And so you're creating new challenges and bottlenecks so that at times what is seen as major efficiency gain, in practice, you create new losses. Food distribution being canceled just because the technology to validate vouchers is not working. And so thinking about constrained environment should always be the critical one. And we define constrained environment both in terms of the access, the political situation, but also in terms of the connectivity, in terms of the readiness for technology, if you like. What is also interesting with technology is once you dig into it, with a number of very notable exceptions like cash-based transfer, but there is a lack of evidence, lack of cost-benefit analysis. Now with Kobo Toolbox, one of the first things we did was to really see, okay, so if we use technology to directly encode our surveys in the field, we know we're going to save time, and intuitively we feel we're going to save money. But what does that look like? With paper, we need to print the paper. We need to then use encoders to transform it into digital data. With technology, we don't need to print, but we need to purchase equipment. We need to train people in a different way. So the costs are different, but even that level of analysis that we've done for some of our tools are rarely done for a large number of tools. Now, it's not perfect, because I also compare and saying, look, you cannot do a cost-benefit analysis of a typewriter versus a computer, because the computer will do what the typewriter does, but will do so much more as well. So it's not simple, but still there is really an important need to strengthen monitoring, to strengthen our analysis of the use of technology, as opposed to almost a blind faith in its benefit. And that extends to unintended consequences of technology. And at times it's not about comparing what is technology, is the technology working, but also is the technology bringing benefits to what we are able to do. Because very often, once you start investing in technology, you are displacing those existing solutions. And here, let me talk, for example, about community feedback mechanism. uh, helpline are a fantastic tool. There's no question that they are valuable. But what I have seen is that once organizations start investing in a technology-based type of community feedback mechanism, they are often abandoning the true in-person community contact, face-to-face type of mechanism. And the reality is, what our study shows is that both serve very different purpose. It is true that by using helpline, you gain some confidentiality and people may be more comfortable expressing some more sensitive aspects. But it is also true that once you analyze what people are talking on the helpline, it's very technical. I've lost my card. How do I replace it? My card is not working. What is happening? So very practical feedback, as opposed to really the type of engagement that we all believe is necessary, for example, to show respect, understanding, and better address the needs. One thing I will ask the facilitator is if they can help me translate some of the question. I'm looking at them at the same time, but that will be helpful. I saw the one coming in Spanish. I can speak in French, but my Spanish is very limited. So back to the presentation, we talked about the technology itself and some of the lessons learned around technologies themselves. Let's talk about policies and processes. We are no longer where we were 10 years ago, thankfully. And by that, I mean a space where almost anything could be done with very, very little oversight, very little guidance, and frankly, creating important protection and other forms of risks for the communities that are served by humanitarians. There has been a very rapidly expanding focus on what are the right policies and process, what guidelines, what ethical principles should be guiding the use of technology. And that's really, really good news, that these reflections are happening and that these documents exist. But the key lesson learned, though, is that compliance is still really, really low, that there is very limited accountability for what happens in the field, for digital risks, for problems that are happening. What we see is that because of some of the constraint with the technology itself, because of the challenge to use them, people regularly circumvent the right processes to make it easy for themselves. It's understandable. It's not like they need to be punished for it, but if the technology doesn't help solve or doesn't fit within people's ability to operate and comply with those rules, then there is a problem. And so that goes also to the question of oversight. Who is responsible? And I've seen many organizations where you've got one part that is responsible for data protection, another part that's responsible for cybersecurity, another part that's responsible for the implementation and of cash transfer and protection aspects, but they don't talk to each other. And there are many, many gaps, many issues in terms of ensuring that the right processes are in place for the responsible use of technology. And here I'll go back to what I was mentioning before, which is that there is this gap in monitoring, reporting, and evaluation of technology. At a higher level, there is this real tension that has not been resolved. So while I say that there's lessons learned, I guess it's sometimes questions learned. And this difficulty of navigating the centralization of technology services and at the same time the importance of localization. Centralization makes sense on a number of factors. For interoperability, for security reasons, you want to have a set of tools that are validated, that are vetted, that we know work well and are safe to use. But how does that work with the localization agenda? How does that work when an organization's work can kind of impose on its implementing partner one tool and another organizations impose a different tool that does exactly the same thing? Or partners are faced with these demands, none of which benefits them because those tools might be proprietary and they will not be able to use them in the long run. So there's really this major tension here that we need to figure out in terms of what can be centralized, ways of doing things, security protocols, and what needs to be localized, solution that are matching what people are already using, that are matching what people are comfortable with, and that frankly create mutual benefits over time. And here, thinking about the policies and process and the way technology has been implemented, very often we see this sense that the drive is incremental gains in efficiency. Now, efficacy is important. We want to make sure that people are served well, but efficiency is sometimes about making sure that the life of humanitarians is easier, that verification protocols are simpler to implement. But what happens when those efficiency gains are balanced with potential risks for protection? And I have seen organizations that privilege efficiency. I've seen others that privilege protection. Clearly, my perspective is on protection and in the importance of making broad protection, not just data protection, not just cybersecurity aspects, but people's protection. Broad protection must be much more central to our technology efforts. I'll go quickly so we have time for some of the discussions and questions, but want to mention the two additional lessons learned, the people and the partnership. So on the people, again, the opportunities of technology, especially when we talk directly around service provision, is clearly that it can bring more flexibility to services. Cash transfer using mobile money is a great example of something that can be very flexible, that can give more dignity to people, like where they are empowered and can make decisions themselves. But is it inclusive? And while the sector as a whole is clearly extremely concerned with inclusivity, is clearly concerned, for example, with gender equity and women's empowerment, when it comes to technology, it doesn't really translate all the time. It doesn't clearly show a systematic consideration for the risk of exclusion. It doesn't show a solution or thinking that might be appropriate for some minority group or for women or for specific group. And again, this lack of monitoring, this lack of evaluation of technology really hinders the ability to capture what some of those challenges may be. And now it's been recognized. Again, cash transfer is an exception because of the quality of the work that, for example, the Cash Learning Partnership has done on learning, but it's not reproduced elsewhere. So we see unintended consequences happen, and that can create or change the burden of technology. Now, for example, when an organization does cash transfers and bring cash, of course, they are shouldering the big risk that they could be attacked and lose that cash. Now, people receiving the cash still face some risk as well. But once you're starting using mobile money, the risk for the organization transferring is very low. The risk for the people receiving it and then having to go to a point to collect actual cash can be higher. And we have seen experience of sellers misinforming people about their balance. We've seen sellers creating barriers to access. And so it does create or certainly change the burden and how the people served by humanitarians are potentially shouldering a higher level of the burden than in the past. I also, for people, mentioned that very often one of the lessons learned is that digital risks are treated very separately from physical risks. And yet we know that they are linked. We know that if people's digital information is leaked, hacked, made public, it does create physical risks, but it's not well planned for. And we don't, unfortunately, have to look far to find an example where, while there are major efforts to protect digital information, the physical response to a hack is much harder to implement, and not every organization, frankly, has the resources to do that. And so again, we go back to this idea of a strong technical focus rather than the broad protection when it comes to technology and the use of technology. On the people, I did want to also mention the other people, the humanitarians themselves, which are critical assets to humanitarian response. But what we see is this increased capacity gap, the level of complexity, the level of requirements around digital tools, around digital literacy is increasing rapidly, and the capacities are not. The skill development exists. There are some courses online very often where people can learn, but it's really far from creating a curriculum, from identifying what are those skills, what are the knowledge, what are the practice that we want people to make sure they are very sensitive to. And the reality is people learn on the ground as they are doing. It's very difficult to get people, to give people the time and the space to reflect and really learn on digital literacy. There is no credentialing. There is no system that, you know, you have to refresh your course on data protection every year, otherwise you lose access to data or things like that. So, you know, there's a lot of work that can be done around skill development. And importantly, the one lessons learned from evaluation I've done is that if those skill development concerns exist, they are within the organization. But who has the mandate? Who does that for implementing partners? So a common criticism would be that, oh yeah, implementing partners are not as safe as us. Well, who's responsible with equipping them with the skills, knowledge on how to responsibly use technology? Lastly, I just want to mention also that so far I have to see, for example, human resources strategy that are specific to technology, that are specific, for example, to women in technology. They remain very, very rare. Maybe also on the policy side, to show some of the gaps, very few organizations have clear data retention policies. How long are they going to collect data? If someone wants their data erased, what's the process? What is possible? So there are so many challenges that are remaining here. Lastly, I want to talk about lessons learned on partnerships, which do provide important value added. That, you know, technology, data is at the center of many new partnership, data sharing agreements, protocols, but also, and I think this is key, engagement both with the private sector and with governments. And again, this is maybe more a question learned or question pending as opposed to a lessons learned, but how to operate these is very challenging. Let me start with service with government. We increasingly see organizations, United Nations agencies with humanitarian mandate, but also non-governmental organizations engage in service to government. Service, for example, around safety nets. Service in terms of technology provision. But this creates important implication both in terms of sustainability, in terms of mandate, in terms of capacity to assist and provide IT support, and exit strategy, but also creates perspective issues around reputational risk, around principles, independence, impartiality. Like how can you balance some of these concerns? With the private sector, we've seen some partnerships raise real high concern, both among humanitarians and among community, and very often it's primarily because reputational risks are not considered, because transparency is not part of the process towards those partnership. So I mentioned it's some lessons learned, but rather a lot of lessons that needs to be learned on how to do those things well. I do want to emphasize again that the progress has been tremendous. Just looking at the policies and process, which of course implementation, of course compliance remains a problem, but just to see what has happened, the level of reflection that the field has had over the last decade is remarkable. We just need to now continue on this trend. So I'll stop here with what turned out to be a much longer talk than I thought, and maybe open to question. And I'll see if the Q&A is there, but if someone can help moderate, that would be helpful. I don't know if I open the floor, but thank you very much. Thank you, Emerson.
Muchas gracias al profesor Patrick. Profesor Patrick, ya le habilitamos las preguntas. Aprovechamos para mencionar, el profesor Patrick es el director de investigación y profesor asistente de la iniciativa humanitaria de Harvard. y también es profesor asociado adjunto del Centro Payson para el Desarrollo Internacional de la Universidad de Tulane. Muchísimas gracias por su presentación sobre lecciones aprendidas y casos en el aprovechamiento de nuevas tecnologías. Mientras vamos preparando las preguntas, aprovechamos para mencionar que el profesor Patrick no solo trabaja con Kobo, es cofundador y director de Kobo Toolbooks, justamente el servicio de recopilación de datos que él nos acaba de presentar y que es ampliamente utilizado en el ámbito humanitario. Y también es miembro justamente de Data Pop Alliance. Muchísimas gracias por su presentación. Profesor Patrick, tenemos un par de preguntas para iniciar. Entonces, la primera pregunta justamente está relacionada con Kobo. ¿Qué hay más allá de Kobo? ¿Qué se piensa en el futuro?
It's a challenge. Kobo is a free and open source, and the idea behind Kobo was always to improve the quality of data that humanitarians can rely on, so that better decisions can be made. Frankly, the tool was started because we needed it. I was in the field, we were doing assessment, and we were very frustrated by the gap that existed between the time we completed data collection and the time we were able to provide insights. And so the timing was the first drive, but then in the process now we've able to make sure we improve quality, that you're able to do things that were impossible with paper in terms of complex forms, skipping patterns, capturing different type of data. I've seen people using Kobo to take pictures and associated with malnutrition to diagnose edema and things like that. So we have an incredible tool that is available there. And by the way, there are other tools that are just incredibly good as well. So it's not just Kobo, but this focus on digital data collection has been amazing. But I think what's next for Kobo, I mentioned it in here, which is for me to really ensure that we can effectively capture and do mixed methods. That is really combine the value of quantitative approach, because measuring things remains important, but enhance that with the depth of qualitative data collection. And so this natural language processing is a big part of where we see Kobo happening. And frankly, I hope that at some point we will be able to interact with communities in a very conversational and natural manner, as opposed to this very kind of foreign, extractive, form-based assessment, but rather do this as part of a dialogue, part of a discussion, so that we strengthen again this relation between humanitarians and communities affected by disaster. There are many other things in the future of Kobo. We are working and constantly improving the tool. We are at the moment translating to make sure it's useful for Ukraine. We are beefing up security all the time because of increased cybersecurity risks. I mean, so there are many things happening at Kobo, but in the long term, this is one of our big focus. Thank you.
Muy bien, profesor Patrick, muchísimas gracias por su respuesta. Justamente tenemos un par de preguntas relacionadas con Kobo también de los invitados y de los asistentes a nuestro evento, y es cómo incentivar el uso natural justamente de estas nuevas tecnologías en el ámbito humanitario, es decir, cómo lograr que las organizaciones del ámbito humanitario se apropien muchísimo más del uso de estas tecnologías.
You know, there are a number of elements to this. I mean, one is that when there is value, adoption happens quite quickly and automatically. I'll go back. I mean, I don't want to talk just, it's not just Kobo, but I think cash transfer and mobile-based cash transfer is the same, is that, you know, we never campaigned, we never had to kind of convince people. We use the tool, people see the value, there's clear added benefits, and so people start adopting it quite quickly. But then the question is, how do we make sure it's done well? And many times I've had that concern. by making data collection easier, we're also making it easier to collect bad data. We're also making it possible for people to do assessments that are not representative, where questions are poorly asked, where ways that people are approached can be re-traumatizing. I mean, so there are many, many concerns just on that, for example. And so it's again about accompanying these rollout and adoption of technology with the proper lessons learned, with the proper evaluations, with the proper instruction and information to make sure that people are using them well. And again, cash learning partnership. Those learning partnerships are extremely valuable to establish that, to help people identify, create guidelines on those aspects. Now, I see in the chat, you're right. People can learn a lot of these things on YouTube. You can just Google how to do a survey and you will learn how to do a survey. But one, that content is not always vetted, and there are also a number of bad videos. But also the problem is when you're kind of taking these ad hoc pieces of information, you're missing the ability of creating a coherent curriculum, a coherent set of skills and knowledge, even on purely basic digital literacy. I grew up with the creation of computer almost. So I learned digital literacy in a way that kids today may be very differently exposed to it. But many people in the world are not growing with computers, and the use of cell phone might still be relatively foreign. And so, you know, it's really important that especially for staff, but also for communities, that we devote and make sure the resources are there to enhance that learning. And here I want to elaborate a little bit more on one thing that's in the slide, and I didn't mention as much, but is this kind of satisfaction with status quo. And what I meant by that is, for example, we very well know that people, the consent that we obtain when we collect data, the consent that we obtain, for example, around cash transfer or data collection, is not based on a true informed consent. We have seen places where people feel that that's the only option, otherwise they will not get assistance, or where their understanding of the risk is extremely limited. Many people are aware of this, many people are concerned with this, but it's very difficult to get movement. How do we change this? How do we create better protective mechanism around these issues? I think these are important questions, and that's where an audience like you, who are confronted with those challenges on a daily basis, need to be involved in those kind of discussion. Over to you.
Profesor Patrick, muchísimas gracias. Tenemos otra pregunta. ¿Podría dar un ejemplo de los resultados obtenidos por reconocimiento de voz automatizado de entrevistas abiertas con posibles beneficiarios de respuesta humanitaria?
This is early stage, right? So it's not like you can go today and record interviews and then click a button and you will get charts and graphs that tells you what people are talking about and what the issues are. And nor is it necessarily the exact desired outcome. But what I can tell you is that getting feedback, community feedback, for example, on how the response to Ebola is happening, this is qualitative feedback. It's very difficult to do it quantitatively because we cannot expect, even if you work with and co-create instruments with people with the local knowledge, it's very difficult to anticipate all potential aspects of how a response is perceived. So qualitative data is critical to be able to capture those unintended consequences and perception. So it has to be qualitative. The automated transcription, translation, and analysis allows you to then very quickly process that information. Again, the most obvious one that people have seen very frequently would be a sentiment analysis, just to say, look, most of the message are positive, or most of the message are negative. Most express concern, most express satisfaction. Just that is already valuable to get kind of a sense of what's going on. But then it's also very easy to look at keywords and start categorizing what kind of concerns are people talking about. Are the concerns about vaccines, about the fact that people don't have access to them? Or are the concerns that people don't believe Ebola is real? Or are the concerns that people don't think the vaccine works? These are three very different concerns that require three very different responses. Natural language processing can help you get to that information much faster than any other means. That is what we are trying to achieve here. I hope this example speaks to the audience here. Obviously, this is applicable to Zika. This is applicable to other outbreaks that are maybe more relevant to Colombia. Thank you.
Profesor Patrick, muchísimas gracias. Muy clara su respuesta. Muchas gracias. Esta pregunta tiene algo de contexto. Dice, en mi organización domiciliada en Venezuela, estamos utilizando las encuestas para conocer de forma cualitativa las violaciones que padecen las personas afectadas por enfermedades crónicas. Estamos utilizando la plataforma Cobo, pero ocurre que la persona que realiza la encuesta no siempre transcribe de manera exacta lo que recibe del afectado. La pregunta es, ¿hay alguna alternativa para corregir este tipo de errores?
So there are a couple of issues to address that kind of error. Now, I'm not criticizing you at all, but one is a training issue. It is very difficult. Let's just even talk about translation. It's very difficult to get interviewer not to interpret what people are saying, but to record it in almost verbatim manner. And I face that all the time because I am a foreigner in most cases. And so if I go, I don't speak the language. And so I will work with a translator. And very often I get the sense that the translator is telling me, well, he's saying this, but what he really means is that. And so they are at times interpreting. And so they're training, spending time explaining people the content of the form, the importance of transcribing what people are saying. All these are really, really important steps. Now, I understand that with Venezuela, for example, and we've seen remote work, it can be very difficult to create that type of feedback or training. So this brings me to the second aspect, which is that quality control, and that's what Kobo is good at, is allows you to almost in real time see what people are saying. And what we very often do is compare interviewers to interviewers. It should be reliable. So the responses, once you've reached a number of people, you would anticipate that the responses are fairly similar unless people are working with very different groups. But if I have two interviewers doing interviews with similar people in the same place, over time, I would expect that the responses are somewhat similar. And yet sometimes I will find one interviewer that has a very different record, where maybe one interviewer has 90% of the people are satisfied with the response to the outbreak, then the other interviewer has 90% who are dissatisfied with the response. How is it possible that in the same community with the same people, those two interviewers would get such different results? So when we see those kind of things, we go back to them and ask them what is going on, what is happening, try to understand. Maybe they misunderstood the question. Maybe that's actually really what happened, but we really do this kind of quality control. The last part, well, two more parts. One additional part, of course, is how you design your form and making sure that people have the space to enter qualitative data, but I think that's obvious. And so now you've got this third aspect, which does require a little more work, but again, touches on quality control. You can now create a record, a voice record of the interview at the same time as you're doing the interview. And so if you have concern that interviewers are not transcribing correctly what is being said, collect the audio, select a random number of audio and see whether those audio match what has been recorded. And if it does not, then talk to the interviewer and again, hold them accountable, because your interviewer are your only eyes, your only ears in the field. I always say this in our training, is that their role is critical. If they don't do a good job, we don't understand what is happening. If we don't understand what's happening, we cannot have a good response. So again, multiple ways, but that's where I just want to emphasize, actually, this is a good point to again remind people that in some ways it's again less about the technology and more about the technology use. That's where those lessons learned are critical. Over to you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Patrick. Esta pregunta está relacionada con la anterior y es justamente sobre qué otras recomendaciones le haría a la comunidad humanitaria para el levantamiento de información.
Well, first, I'm not sure that the primary recommendation would be to collect more information. Probably the first recommendation would be to check what information you have and see if you really need to collect more information. You know, there's a lot to be said about coordination. We're not going to go into data exchange because it is complex, but there are very valuable efforts. The humanitarian data exchange, HDX, is a very good example, an important one, where we really need to be better at taking stock of what is existing and what is needed to collect. The second thing would be, before you collect the data, ask yourself, how is it going to be used, and make sure that that gap, that decision gap between the data being collected and operational changes happening is minded, that you clearly have a process to ensure that when you're collecting data, it's actually useful for something. I know it's very, very obvious, but again, we see it all the time where a lot of the data collected is either never exploited or it's purely kind of used as a diagnostic, but it doesn't lead to change. It doesn't lead to improving what is being done. I would stop there because you know, it's such a broad question. Of course, there are many aspects to collecting data. I still firmly believe in the importance of contact. The limitations of remote interviews are really important to understand. And so weighting up options here is critical as well. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm providing a good answer, but I feel like in some ways I would focus on what happens before you collect the data and what happens after you collect the data more than on how you collect the data, which is of course is essential, but there are very good tools and very good guidance on that part, not necessarily on those other aspects. Thank you.
Profesor Patrick, muchas gracias. Tenemos un par de preguntas más para empezar a preparar el cierre de su conferencia. La primera está relacionada justamente con lo que nos acaba de mencionar de las brechas. Tiene un poco de contexto esta pregunta. En algunos contextos, en nuestros países en vía de desarrollo, tenemos limitado acceso a la tecnología por parte de nuestros beneficiarios e incluso los recursos son limitados por parte de las ONGs para implementar los diferentes proyectos sociales. ¿Cómo cree usted que se puede disminuir esa brecha?
It's a very important question, and I think that the awareness, the recognition of this gap is there. Part of the challenge is who is mandate with filling that gap. Certainly, United Nations agencies working on this see the gap, but I've had that response all the time. Well, it's not our job to train people on digital literacy. it's not our job to equip them with internet to some extent. I mean, of course, there is the ETC cluster, and there's some sector-wide effort, for example, on connectivity, but there is this question of who is responsible for that. And there's no easy answer to that. I do think that increasingly donors are engaging directly with organizations on the ground. And that is really an important aspect to make sure that those organizations at the front line are then able to benefit from the response, not in a bad way. What I mean is benefit in terms of strengthening their access to technology, strengthening their knowledge and skills, which is not always prioritized by a Western model of humanitarian intervention. And so I think we're seeing this change. I would be very curious whether that is truly happening, and whether it does lead to this more equal and mutually beneficial humanitarian response, if that makes sense. Thank you. I don't think I really answered, but it is a big challenge.
Tranquilo, profesor Patrick, muchas gracias. Quisiéramos ya preparar el cierre con dos preguntas más. La primera sería con contextos. Dice, en los países desarrollados tenemos una gran dependencia de la tecnología, haciendo referencia justamente a la utilización de estas herramientas, y en general hemos cosechado beneficios. La pregunta es, ¿por qué no deberíamos esperar lo mismo en los países de desarrollo?
You mean why we shouldn't expect the same benefits? Is that...
Sí, señora, así es.
Yeah. I mean, one, we should. I don't think that they are necessarily inherently an inability to benefit from technology, but there is a problem of being fit for purpose. Again, if you rely and what is happening in a response in a highly technological environment allows you to do in-field registration and have being constantly connected to databases of people served by humanitarians, and then you've got these vouchers that are automatically, I mean, this is all fantastic, works really well. And then you go to a place where there's no electricity, or there's electricity 2 hours a day. Of course, it's not going to work. Of course, you cannot get the same benefit. I mean, I feel like I'm saying something so obvious that it's almost silly, but the reason you cannot expect the same benefit is because the context is different, and so you need to understand that context, and that's why I talk about the technology use. It's not really the technology; it's really around those factors. Are the people equipped to leverage the technology? Is the environment conducive to using the technology? Are the partners behaving in a manner that is equitable so that it does benefit people? Because that's also what we see, is that, again, international organization will impose some tool that is not the one that people use locally, but now they have to switch to this different tool that is a tool that they won't be able to afford 3 months later when the response or that partnership is over. So there is no sustainability or no long-term benefits from there. So so I'm making this long, but again, it's about fit for purpose, it's about the context, and it's about how we approach those partnerships and making sure that there is actually an opportunity for those benefits to be realized. Thank you. Challenging question, by the way.
Profesor Patrick, lo sabemos. Muchas gracias. Quisiéramos cerrar su presentación con una pregunta en torno a un tema que ha sido sensible y que se ha abordado en diferentes momentos a lo largo de este evento, y tiene que ver con la ética. Quisiéramos conocer cuál es su posición o cuál es el papel de la tecnología de la información, de las tecnologías de la información y la ética en este campo específicamente.
I mean, can there be any other position that obviously it has to be ethical, it has to be responsible? And I think I talked to it, to that to some extent, which is that at times, and it's not true everywhere. I mean, I don't want to make too big of a generalization, but at times, the drive for efficacy, the drive for efficiency, the drive for saving lives, as is being described, means, well, yeah, of course, we're creating some risks, or there's potential data protection risk, for example, but we're saving lives. This is not enough. I mean, that is no longer acceptable. We need to be held to much higher ethical standards in how we do things, how we operate. I talked about consent, which consent is really about the respect for person. It's really around making sure that we are considering and acting with the respect for the people we are serving. We did survey recently in Eastern DRC. 10% of the people feel that they are treated with respect by humanitarian actors. If the use of technology extends that structure, it really means that we are not using technology with respect. We are not really creating an ethical use of technology. Now, the question is, how do we get there? Are there specific ethical standards that need to be used by humanitarian? Well, yes and no. There are clear humanitarian principles. There are also very clear ethical principles that have been established around, for example, bioethics and using medicine. But those principles really translate to what we do in humanitarian settings, doing no harm. There are other, of course, sets of principles in the humanitarian sector as well. So the principles exist. They are there. How do we enforce them? How do we use them? Some organizations like MSF have an internal ethic board that review what happens, that review both what happens in terms of how they collect data, that review what happens in terms of ethical decision being made on a daily basis when you treat people in such environments. But not every organization has the same resource, not all organization has the same experience. And that is critical because we see so many new humanitarian actors emerging, for example, around the use of technology, that do not have that kind of ethical grounding and understanding of the ethical challenges of humanitarian action. So in short, there's no simple answer except this major call. It is way past the time to be very serious about ethics in technology in humanitarian context. Those conversations are happening. The gap goes again to the implementation, enforcement, compliance around what we know should be ethical practices. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a usted, profesor Patrick. Le agradecemos también por crear nuevos conocimientos y promover el liderazgo basado en evidencia en desastres y crisis humanitarias. Con esto cerramos su conferencia. Muchísimas gracias. Las personas que estén interesadas en contactarse de manera directa con él encuentran en la proyección del slide la información de su Twitter y su correo electrónico. Profesor Patrick, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you to you.